In this video, we will look at the sugya on Daf Lamed Aleph of Hadar with regard to the Esrog and Lulav. The Gemara quotes a brayso. The brayso says, Yavish, if something, one of the Arba Minim is Yavish, the Chachamim say it's puzzle, it's unfit to use for your Arba Minim, and Rabbi Yehuda says you can use it, it's kosher. Comes Rabbi and explains. He says, what is this brayso referring to? Which one of the four Minim? The Machlokes regards to the Lulav. However, with regard to the Esrog, everyone would agree that a dry one would be puzzle because you need Hadar. What's the explanation for this Machlokes? So Rabbi says, the reason why the Chachamim argue with regards to Lulav and with Rabbi Yehuda is as follows. The Chachamim say that the pasuk with regards to Esrog says creates Hadar, and in the pasuk it's written right next to the Lulav. So we make a hekesh, a juxtaposition. We compare one item in the pasuk to the other item that is nearby in the pasuk, and just as the Esrog says Hadar, it needs to be Hadar, so too does the Lulav need to be Hadar, and therefore a dry Lulav is puzzle. Rabbi Yehuda, however, does not make this hekesh. So while it's true the Esrog needs to be Hadar, the Lulav does not need to be. And as I said, HaKol Moedim, Rabbi told us that everyone agrees with regard to the Esrog, because there the pasuk clearly says pre-eitz Hadar, that the fruit has to be Hadar. So everyone agrees that a dry Esrog would be puzzle, according to Rava. Gemara then asks a number of questions. Question number one. We have a Mishnah in which Rabbi Yehuda says, this is in fact the first Mishnah in our parak, that if a lulav has spread leaves, the Chachamim said this is okay. But Rabbi Yehuda said, no, spread leaves, it's not kosher. One must yagdenu milmayla. One has to tie them together at the top so that the lulav is all closed up. And our assumption is that the reason why Rabbi Yehuda requires binding the top of the lulav is because otherwise it's not beautiful. It's not hadar. So the question is, clearly we see that Rabbi Yehuda requires hadar by the lulav, not like Rava said that he holds yavesh is kosher even by the lulav. So again, this Mishnah seems to imply that Rabbi Yehuda says a lulav needs to be hadar, not like Rabbi says that the lulav does not need to be hadar. And the answer is no. The Gemara says the reason why Rabbi Yehuda requires hadar by lulav, the reason why Rabbi Yehuda requires binding the lulav has nothing to do with hadar. Rather, it has to do with the word in the pasuk. The pasuk says kapes tamarim, and as we find Rabbi Yehuda saying in the name of Rabbi Tarfon, that the word, as we know in Torah, the words are not written with Nekudas. So even though we have a Messiah, we have a tradition in how to read the words, but it also sometimes leaves us possible ways to interpret words when you read them with other Nekudas. So Kapes Tamarim is what it says in the Pasuk, which means date fronds, date branches. But we could also read it Kafus. Kafus means bound. So it's teaching us that the Lulav needs to be all the leaves together. So if it's still not spreading, then it's perfect. You don't need to tie anything. The leaves are automatically together. But if it starts to spread, so it then must be kafus, it must be tied together so it remains bound. So again, the answer is that it is not, the reason why Rabbi Yehuda requires tying the leaves of the lulav has nothing to do with hadar. It has to do with a special requirement with regards to the lulav that the leaves need to be together. The Gemara then asks a second question. Again, we have a Mishnah later in the parak where Rabbi Yehuda says one must bind the lulav with only its own min, so something using from the min of the lulav, or as others Mefarshim point out, with any of the other minim of the arba minim. And again, our assumption is the reason why one must bind a lulav only using its own min, so say for example the leaves of the lulav, as in fact we do use for our rings, is because otherwise it is not beautiful. And again, we have the question, we see Rabbi Yehuda requires hadar by the lulav, and it's not like Rava told us that he does not. And the Gemara's answer, similar to before, no. The reason why Rabbi Yehuda requires binding a lulav with its own min has nothing to do with hadar. It's because otherwise you would be over bal toisif. You'd be adding to the mitzvah. What does that mean? Because Rabbi Yehuda holds lulav tzarich eged, that the binding is an intrinsic part of the mitzvah. If you do not bind your lulav with the other minim, so with the hadas and the arava, you are not fulfilling your mitzvah of arba minim. In other words, the binding is an integral part of the mitzvah. It's part of the mitzvah, and therefore, if you were to use a fifth min to bind your lulav, you would now have 5 minim in the mitzvah of arba minim, which means you're over bal toisif. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda teaches you must use one of those original 4 for the binding. So now, even though you're including the binding, you only have a total of 4 minim. and support for this understanding, because Rava explains that Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda to say that he even allows binding the tree with the vine of the tree, binding the lulav with the vine of the tree or the bark of the tree, even though this is not beautiful, as Rashi points out, it doesn't appear the same, perhaps it has different coloring. Nevertheless, you are allowed to use it because this din has nothing to do with Hadar, rather it has to do with the concept of Baal Toisef. The Gemara then asks a third question. We have a brisa. The brisa has a number of parts. Part 1, the brisa teaches us that one cannot add ein moisifin and ein poichasin. So one cannot add or detract from the arba minim. Part 2, if one does not have an esrog, he cannot bring neither a pomegranate nor a quince or any other fruit. Third, the brisa says something that is yavish. Chachamim say puzzle, and Rabbi Yehuda says kosher. And finally, the brisa then brings a story. Rabbi Hadar brings a story of people who would give over their lulavim to their grandchildren as inheritance, which seems to prove that dry lulavim are kosher, because obviously by the time their grandchildren were using those lulavim, they would have been easily dried out. And obviously, that story was teaching us that it was still nevertheless good to be used. So he's bringing support that shows that a dry lulav is kosher. And the Chacham say, no, there's no proof from there, because that was a shasad chak, that was a time of desperate time, and therefore desperate measures could be used. Only in such a time could someone use a dry lulav. And it has been pointed out that there are Mefarshim who changed the text here and say they gave it to their children, not to their grandchildren, because it's unlikely that it would be so for such a long time that lulavim would not be found. But nevertheless, the pashtos is the stories they gave it to their grandchildren. So what are we bringing this brisa for? Because in section number 3, in part 3 of this brisa, we saw Rabbi Yehuda says yavish is kosher. And we're assuming that he is referring to the esrog. Why? Because in part 2 we were talking about the esrog, and 3, which immediately follows, we would assume it's referring to the very same one of the minim, the esrog. And we see clearly that he holds that an esrog is yavish. Question: we see Rabbi Yehuda does not require hadar by esrog, which is again unlike what Rava said. So again, the difference between question number 3 and the first 2 questions was that the first 2 questions were referring to the position of Rabbi Yehuda with regards to the lulav. Here we're questioning Rava about his view of Rabbi Yehuda with regards to the esrog. The Gemara answers, no, it is referring to the lulav, as is section number 4. So instead of connecting section 3 to section 2 and say that it's talking about the lulav, connect section 3 to section 4 and it is referring to the lulav. So with regards to the esrog, Rabbi Yehuda does not, with regards to the esrog, Rabbi Yehuda does require hadar. Then the Gemara goes off on a bit of a tangent, although we alluded to the Aruch Laner that explains how this all flows from similar questions. But the taich in the Gemara is that it's on a side note. Omar Mar, we're quoting and explaining something that was quoted earlier. And the Gemara says that the Brisa teaches us that one cannot add or detract from the arba minim. Pshita, obviously you cannot do that. Why would I assume that I can? The Gemara answers, this is coming to teach us according to the view of Rabbi Yehuda, who holds lulav tzarech eged, that one must bind the lulav. And one might assume that if you bring a 5th min and do not include it in the binding, being that Rabbi Yehuda holds that the arba minim you are only yaitza, if it's bound together, so if I bring a 5th min and it's not part of the binding, I might think that it should not be part of the mitzvah at all, and therefore not be a violation of Baal Tosef. It's like I'm wearing shoes while shaking the arba minim, and which has nothing to do with the arba minim. So too, I'm bringing a 5th branch, a rose of some sort, an olive branch, let's say. It has nothing to do with the other arba minim that are in the binding, and therefore I would think that you're not over Baal Tosef. That's why the Brisa has to teach us, no, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, one would be over Baal Tosef in such a case. Second side note, the Brisa we taught also told us that if you do not have an esrog, you cannot bring any other fruit. So again, the Brisa says pshita. Obviously, the Torah says to bring an esrog. Why would I think you can bring any other fruit? So the Gemara answers, no, we would have thought perhaps that if you do not have an esrog, one should bring some other fruit so that the concept of a 4th min should not be forgotten. So teaches us the Brisa that no, because it may lead to a problem. It may lead to that one day when you do have esrogim available again, people would think, hey, look, last year I brought a pomegranate, so perhaps I can bring a pomegranate again this year. So say, for example, if he has an esrog, but the esrog is not as nice as the beautiful pomegranate, So he says, look, if there was a nice, really nice looking esrog, I would take that. But because I have a nicer looking pomegranate, then perhaps that is optimal. So it teaches us the brayso that therefore a person should never ever bring any other fruits, because it may then cause that when esrogim are available, for someone to make a mistake. Then the Gemara comes back to questioning Rava. And here's the final question on Rava. The Gemara says, we have a clear brayso that says an old, or as some amend the text to say a dry esrog, a yavish, a esrog yavish. The Chachamim say is puzzle. Rabbi Yehuda says kosher. So, question we clearly see Rabbi Yehuda says kosher with regards to the esrog, meaning he does not require hadar. And again, this is unlike what Rava says. And the Gemara says, in fact, it is the tiyufta. We do refute, we do slug up the view of Rava's understanding in Rabbi Yehuda. A few points in Rashi, or actually one point in Rashi in this section. Rashi explains the reason why Rabbi Yehuda does not make a hekesh. So we're referring to the hekesh from Esrog to Lulav. This is still in the way Rava understands it. Rashi says the reason why he does not make a hekesh is because he cannot make one logically. It has to be a mesaira, it has to be a tradition. And Rashi points out that the same is true with all of the Yud Gimel Midas, except for the Kal V'chomer, that one must have a tradition, a mesaira, and cannot make it logically. So Rabbi Yehuda does not make a hekesh here because he did not have a mesaira. Some of the Mefarshim ask then, why do the Chachamim make a hekesh? So either they explain that the Chachamim did have a mesaira, or alternatively, and as many point out, more likely, based on views of Rashi elsewhere, that the Chachamim, according to the Chachamim, one does not need a mesaira for a hekesh, so that one could make it logically. Tosfos. So first, Tosfos brings this view of Rashi that you cannot make a hekesh on your own. Tosfos has a big problem with this because he quotes a Gemara, and the Gemara there suggests that everyone agrees that you can make smuchin, which are in two separate psukim. So you could be doirish, you could expound a smuchin on your own. So if you can do smuchin on your own, then you should certainly be allowed to do hekesh on your own, because hekesh is when they're close to each other in the same pasuk, and smuchim is when they're in two separate psukim. So if you can do it in two separate psukim, you can certainly learn one from the other in the same pasuk. So how can Rashi say that you cannot make a hekesh on your own? And therefore Tosfos disagrees with Rashi and says that actually all of the Yud Gimel Midas and the hekesh can be made logically, can be made on your own. You do not need a mesaira. The only one that needs a mesaira is the Gezer Shava. So that brings us to the question, then if so, then why does Rabbi Yehuda not make a hekesh on our Gemara? So Tosfos says it has nothing to do with the mesaira having a tradition or not having a tradition, but over here it's just not logical to do. Why not? So Tosfos suggests perhaps the reason why we do not make a hekesh from Esrog to Lulav is because the word that we're trying to bring over to the Lulav is the word Hadar, and Tosfos says perhaps the word Hadar only applies to fruit and does not apply to trees like the Lulav. Another Tosfos says the Brayso teaches us that if you lay matzah esrog, if you do not find the kosher esrog, you cannot bring other fruit. The implication is that you cannot bring other fruit, but you could bring another type of esrog. So in other words, you cannot find a kosher esrog, perhaps you can bring a pasul esrog and make a bracha. Tosfos says perhaps not. Yesh lidchos, we could say that there's no proper diuk in this, and we explain a number of ways, but it's not necessary to go through them right now. Tosfos says you could perhaps not learn this from this brayso. However, Tosfos says, but later in the brayso we have a story of old Lulavim that were given over as an inheritance, and even though the Chachamim said that is only in the time of a shasat chak, a desperate time, nevertheless, we see the brayso teaching us that in a shasat chak, even the Chachamim would agree that what would normally be a pasul lulav can be used. So perhaps the same should apply to the esrog, that even though it's a pasul esrog, but in a shasat chak, when you do not have a kosher esrog, you may use a pasul esrog. That is what Tosfos says. And the last Tosfos on this section, Tosfos says the brayso teaches us that even though Rabbi Yehuda holds Lulav tzarech eged, you're still over Baal Tosef. Tosfos asks, our Gemara here is telling us that it's only, the brayso is teaching us only because of Rabbi Yehuda. That Rabbi Yehuda holds that Lulav tzarech eged. I would have thought that this would not be Baal Tosef, so the brayso had to teach us that you are over Baal Tosef. So Tosfos says, one second. Earlier in our Gemara, and also elsewhere in Gemara and Sanhedrin, we mentioned that according to the Chachamim, one is much less likely to be over Baal Tosef. We'd be much more likely to view each item that you're bringing independently. Look at them independently. So how is it that the Gemara seems the Gemara clearly says that according to Rabbi Yehuda, we have to teach us that you're over Baal Tosef, and we do not say L'chudei Kai v'L'chudei Kai, telling us that according to the Chachamim, we would certainly not say L'chudei Kai v'L'chudei Kai. Again, the Gemara is telling us that according to Chachamim, we certainly do not look at them independently, and you would be over Baal Tosef. It's only according to Rabbi Yehuda that I would have thought that we do look at them independently. So comes the Brisa to teach us that we do not do so, which is telling us that according to Chachamim, it's more pashut that they're not looked at independently. But we have earlier in our Gemara and elsewhere the view that according to the Chachamim, we are more likely to look at them independently. So how do we reconcile these two Gemaras? So Tosfos says, well, depends on what the context is. And because the case in our Gemara is where you bring the fifth min outside of the binding, so there, yes, it's true that Rabbi Yehuda would be the one who would be more likely to view it independently because it's outside of the binding. According to the Chachamim, there's no difference between in the binding or out of the binding because the binding is not it's not a part of the mitzvah. But in such a case, we would think that according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's as if it's the shoes on your feet. It's not part of the mitzvah at all, and that's why the Brisa had to teach it. But then the question is, so why taka are you over Baal Tosef according to Rabbi Yehuda if it's outside the binding? So Tosfos answers, because yes, it may not be part of the actual mitzvah, but it's derech gidulai. It is you're bringing it in the proper way. You're bringing it in a way that it's standing, as the Gemara teaches us that all the arba minim has to be held the way that it grows, and you are doing it, so it resembles the actual mitzvah. When we mentioned in a previous Gemara that if it's not done if it's not part of the mitzvah, you're not over Baal Tosef. For example, in the case where the Chachamim said that if you bring another min and you bind it, your lulav with that other min, the Chacham said you're not over Baal Tosef. That was because you're also not. It doesn't resemble the mitzvah in any way. It's not standing up. It's not derech gidulai, and that's the distinction. Then Tosfos says, but how can we reconcile the Chachamim's view here with the Chachamim's view in Sanhedrin, where over there they say you do look at it l'chudei be'l'chudei, each min independently, and in our Gemara we do not look at them independently, and the Chachamim would say if you bring a fifth min, you would be over Baal Tosef. So Tosfos says, well, they're talking about two different halachas. In our Gemara, we're saying the Chachamim do not view them independently, and therefore you are over Baal Tosef, which means you are mekayim the mitzvah, and you are over Baal Tosef also. In that Gemara, we're saying with regards to kol ha'moisef gaireya, which means that you're by adding into the mitzvah you're detracting, which means that you are not going to be makayim the mitzvah at all. And there the Chachamim say with regards to that we would view it independently. So almost like there's two layers. At level one, we would say we look at that, we do not look at them independently, so therefore you are over Baal Tosef. But we still view them independently for level two, which would be that we don't say that they're so much lumped together that there's Baal Tosef and there's Kol HaMoisef Gareya that it erases your whole mitzvah. No. With regards to erasing your whole mitzvah, Kol HaMoisef Gareya, there we are ready to look at them independently. The Sfas Emes adds to this and it says that the reason why, according to Rabbi Yehuda, we would be in violation of Baal Tosef, it's outside of the binding. So he gives kind of 2 points really to answer the same answer with 2 points. One, he says, is because even according to Rabbi Yehuda, there is some part of the mitzvah outside of the binding, the Esrog, and therefore, even though you're bringing something outside the binding, you would be over Baal Tosef. Point number 2, he says, perhaps not only is it the Esrog that's outside the binding, but perhaps you can even have some of the Arba Minim outside the binding. And he makes because we learned it from Agudas Ezai, where there we find you only need 3 things to be part of the binding, and therefore he suggests that perhaps a big major chiddush that you could even have the lulav, 1 hadas and 1 arava in the binding, and you can have the other 2 hadasim and the other arava outside the binding. So we certainly have parts of the mitzvah outside the binding.